Adolf Hitler is one of the most controversial figures in human history. This documentary tells his life story from a failed artist and wounded soldier to a dictator whose decisions reshaped the world. A powerful reminder of how ambition, hatred, and unchecked power can lead to unimaginable tragedy.
A child caught between fear and dreams. Adolf Hitler was born on April 20th, 1889, in a small Austrian town near the German border. At the time, his arrival meant nothing to the world. He was simply a child born into an ordinary family, surrounded by quiet streets, modest houses, and the slow rhythm of provincial life. No one could have imagined that this boy would one day become a symbol of destruction and division. As a child, Adolf appeared unremarkable. He enjoyed wandering outdoors, sketching buildings, and losing himself in imagined futures. Drawing was not just a hobby for him, it was an escape. When he held a pencil, the world felt ordered, controllable, and safe. In those moments, he was free. But freedom did not exist inside his home. His father, Adolf Hitler, was a rigid and demanding man. He believed in discipline, obedience, and practicality above all else. Alois had worked his way into a stable government position and expected his son to follow the same path. To him, success meant authority and respect, not imagination or creativity. Whenever Adolf spoke about becoming an artist, his father dismissed the idea with anger and ridicule. Art, in Alois's eyes, was useless. It offered no power, no security, no status. Their conversations often ended in shouting, followed by silence heavy with fear. Adolf learned early that speaking his dreams aloud came at a cost. His mother, Clara, was very different. Gentle and deeply affectionate, she saw her son's sensitivity and protected him whenever she could. She encouraged his drawings and listened when he spoke of distant cities filled with beauty and meaning. Yet her love could not shield him from his father's authority. She supported Adolf quietly, knowing confrontation would only make things worse. This imbalance shaped Adolf's inner world. At school, teachers noticed that he was intelligent, capable of learning quickly when he wanted to, but his interest faded whenever the subject failed to inspire him. Rules felt oppressive, authority felt unfair. Slowly, resistance replaced effort. At home, tension became routine. His father's voice dominated the household, while Adolf retreated inward. He learned to remain silent, not because he agreed, but because silence hurt less than confrontation. Inside, resentment began to root. When Adolf was 13 years old, his father suddenly died. To outsiders, it seemed like a moment of release, an end to strict control. But for Adolf, the loss created confusion rather than relief. The conflict that had defined his childhood vanished without resolution. There was no final victory, no closure, only absence. Without his father's pressure, Adolf drifted. School lost its meaning, structure disappeared. His once promising academic performance declined, not because he lacked ability, but because he lacked direction. He devoted himself almost entirely to drawing, clinging to the one identity that still felt true. What no one noticed was that beneath his artistic dreams, something darker was forming, a deep fear of failure and an intense need to prove his worth. Failure, poverty, and a broken identity. As a young man, Adolf left his hometown and moved to Vienna, the cultural heart of Austria. To him, the city represented everything he believed he was meant for: art, recognition, and purpose. Vienna's grand architecture and vibrant creative life filled him with confidence. He was certain that this was where his real life would begin. He applied to the Academy of Fine Arts with hope burning inside him. Acceptance would mean validation. Rejection would mean nothing, because rejection, he believed, was impossible. When the letter arrived, it shattered that illusion. The Academy dismissed his work as insufficient. The words struck deeper than simple disappointment. They questioned his identity. Still, he refused to give up. He convinced himself that the judges were wrong, that they had failed to see his potential. He would try again. The following year, he reapplied, and once again, he was rejected. This second refusal crushed him completely. It was no longer just the Academy saying no. It was the world. The future he had imagined collapsed overnight. Without education, without professional skills, and without family support, Adolf slipped into poverty. His life in Vienna became a struggle for survival. He lived in overcrowded shelters and tiny rented rooms, sometimes sleeping outdoors. Food was uncertain. Money came only from selling small paintings and postcards to strangers who barely noticed him. Each day reinforced the same question: why am I failing when I deserve more? During this period, tragedy struck again. His mother, Clara, the one person who had believed in him without conditions, passed away. Her death left him completely alone. Grief hardened into bitterness. Loss turned into anger. Instead of reflecting inward, Adolf began looking outward for blame. He convinced himself that unseen forces, unfair systems, and other people were responsible for his suffering. This mindset offered comfort. Failure no longer belonged to him. Vienna, once a city of dreams, became a symbol of humiliation. He observed society from its edges, feeling excluded and ignored. His isolation deepened, and with it grew a belief that the world was divided into those who deserved success and those who stood in the way. By the time he left Vienna, Adolf Hitler was no longer just a failed artist. He was a man carrying resentment, unresolved grief, and a dangerous hunger for meaning. War and the discovery of purpose. In 1914, Europe descended into chaos. World War I began, pulling nations into a conflict unlike anything the world had seen before. For many, it was a nightmare. For Adolf Hitler, it was an opportunity. He volunteered for the German army with enthusiasm. War offered life what it had denied him: structure, belonging, and a clear sense of purpose. For the first time, he felt part of something larger than himself. As a soldier, Adolf found validation through obedience and duty. Orders were clear, loyalty was rewarded, courage mattered. He served as a messenger, carrying information across dangerous battlefields. The risk gave him direction. The danger gave him identity. His bravery did not go unnoticed. He received medals for his service, symbols that proved his worth in ways art never had. In the trenches, he felt respected. He felt necessary. But war does not end with meaning. It ends with consequences. In 1918, Germany was defeated. The armistice shocked Adolf deeply. To him, the loss was unbearable. He could not accept that the sacrifice had been meaningless. He searched for explanations that preserved his sense of purpose. Instead of seeing defeat as a result of military reality, he embraced the idea of betrayal. He became convinced that Germany had not been beaten on the battlefield, but undermined from within. This mindset offered comfort. Failure no longer belonged to him. Germany, like Adolf himself, was wounded, humiliated, and desperate. He saw his own struggles reflected in the nation's collapse.
and for the first time he imagined himself not as a victim of history, but as someone who could shape it. The war had given him more than medals. It had given him a mission.
Words that turned anger into power. When the war ended, Germany was left broken. The streets told the story before newspapers ever could. Veterans returned with empty pockets and haunted eyes. Families struggled to find food. The economy collapsed, and faith in leadership disappeared. People were angry, confused, and desperate for answers. Adolf Hitler returned to this wounded nation carrying his own unresolved rage. He had lost the war that gave his life meaning, but he had not lost his sense of purpose. Instead, it transformed. Where once he had carried messages across battlefields, now he carried ideas, ideas shaped by bitterness and belief. At first, his role was small. He joined a minor political group known as the German Workers' Party. It was insignificant, disorganized, and largely ignored by the public. But Adolf quickly discovered something that changed everything. When he spoke, people listened. He was not calm or polite. His speeches were emotional, filled with frustration and promises. He spoke about humiliation, betrayal, and lost pride. He did not offer complex solutions. He offered certainty. In a time of chaos, certainty was powerful. Crowds began to grow. Adolf understood something instinctively. People did not want facts. They wanted someone to blame and someone to follow. He shaped his words to match their pain. He told them they were victims, not failures, that their suffering was not their fault, that Germany's greatness had been stolen and could be restored. As his influence increased, he took control of the party and reshaped it entirely. It was renamed the National Socialist German Workers' Party, later known simply as the Nazi Party. He designed its symbols, its structure, and its message. The red flag, the black emblem, the bold imagery, everything was meant to inspire loyalty and identity. Meetings became larger. His voice grew louder, his gestures sharper. He spoke with absolute confidence, even when his ideas were extreme. Supporters did not question him. They believed him. What began as political ambition slowly turned into obsession. Adolf no longer saw disagreement as difference of opinion. It became opposition. And opposition, in his mind, could not be tolerated. Germany, still weak and divided, was listening. Failure, prison, and a dangerous rebirth. By 1923, Adolf believed the moment had come to seize power by force. Germany's government was unstable, and economic despair filled the streets. He convinced himself that bold action would ignite a national uprising in his favor. The plan was reckless. Adolf and his followers attempted to overthrow the government in what became known as the Beer Hall Putsch. It was chaotic and poorly executed. Police confronted the marchers. Shots were fired. The uprising collapsed almost as quickly as it began. Instead of rising as a hero, Adolf was arrested. For the first time since discovering his influence, he faced complete failure in public view. The man who spoke of strength now stood powerless before the law. Many believed his political career was over. But prison did not silence him. During his time behind bars, Adolf did not reflect with regret. Instead, he refined his beliefs. He used isolation as an opportunity to organize his thoughts and justify his actions. With the help of close supporters, he wrote a book outlining his world view and ambitions. It was titled Mein Kampf, My Struggle. The book revealed his mindset clearly, a belief in absolute control, racial division, and national destiny. It was not just political theory, it was a warning. At the time, few took it seriously. After serving a relatively short sentence, Adolf was released. He walked out of prison changed, not humbled, but more calculated. He had learned an important lesson.
Force alone would not give him power. Legitimacy had to come first. The Nazi Party, once weakened by failure, began to rebuild, this time with discipline, patience, and a clear long-term plan. Adolf Hitler had lost a battle, but in his mind, the war for Germany's future was far from over, and this time he intended to win it, legally, before controlling it completely.
Power, hope, and the illusion of rebirth. By the early 1930s, Germany was exhausted. Years of economic hardship had drained the nation's spirit. Inflation destroyed savings. Unemployment shattered families. Democracy felt weak, slow, and incapable of restoring stability. People did not just want change, they wanted certainty. Adolf Hitler understood this hunger perfectly. Through relentless campaigning, calculated speeches, and carefully crafted public appearances, he presented himself as the answer to Germany's suffering. He promised jobs, pride, and national renewal. His message was simple and emotionally charged. Germany had been humiliated, but it could rise again. In 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. To many, it felt like hope had finally arrived. Soon after taking office, visible changes began to appear. Construction projects expanded across the country. Roads, factories, and public works created employment. The economy showed signs of recovery. For ordinary citizens, daily life improved enough to inspire trust. People saw results, and results created loyalty. But behind this image of progress, Adolf was moving quickly to secure absolute control. He used fear and opportunity side by side. A fire at the German Parliament building became the perfect excuse to silence opposition. Emergency laws were passed. Civil liberties were suspended. Political rivals were arrested or forced into silence. Power no longer belonged to institutions, it belonged to one man. Adolf reshaped the government to serve his vision. Independent voices disappeared. Courts, police, and lawmakers fell under his influence. The nation slowly shifted from a republic into a dictatorship, though many citizens barely noticed the transition. Stability had replaced chaos, and that was enough. Propaganda became a daily presence. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, and public events repeated the same message. Germany was strong again because of Adolf. Children learned his image. Adults heard his voice everywhere. Doubt was drowned out by repetition. To his supporters, he was not just a leader, he was a symbol of rebirth. What they could not see was the cost of this rebirth and how fragile it truly was. Total control and the shaping of a nation. Once power was secured, Adolf Hitler no longer hid his intentions. Unity in his vision meant obedience. Diversity of thought was treated as weakness. Loyalty was no longer encouraged, it was demanded. Political opposition vanished entirely. Those who disagreed were labeled enemies of the state. Many were imprisoned, others disappeared quietly. Fear became an unspoken rule that governed everyday life. Adolf created new organizations to enforce his ideology. An elite security force was formed to protect the regime and eliminate threats. At the same time, children were recruited into youth groups designed to shape their beliefs from an early age. They were taught discipline, obedience, and devotion to the state above family or self. The future, Adolf believed, must belong only to those who accepted his vision. Public life transformed. Flags and symbols filled streets and buildings. Large rallies gathered thousands, their voices merging into a single chant of loyalty. Adolf stood before them, speaking with absolute certainty. His words left no room for questions, only belief. Education was rewritten. History was reshaped to serve ideology. Media told only one story. Slowly, individual thought faded as collective identity took its place. Many Germans accepted this transformation willingly. Stability felt safer than freedom. Order felt better than uncertainty. And for those who benefited from the system, silence was easy. But beneath the surface, something dangerous was taking shape. Adolf's worldview divided people into categories of worth and unworthiness. Compassion was replaced with suspicion. Humanity was filtered through ideology. By the time the nation realized how far it had gone, turning back was no longer possible. Germany had become a state built on control, fear, and unquestioned loyalty, ready to follow its leader wherever he chose to go next. And Adolf Hitler was already looking beyond Germany's borders.
War without limits. By the late 1930s, Adolf Hitler no longer saw Germany as a nation among others. In his mind, it was a force meant to expand, dominate, and reshape Europe. Years of unchecked power had removed restraint. Diplomacy became a tool only when it served conquest. In 1939, that ambition turned into action. German forces crossed into Poland, triggering a conflict that would soon involve much of the world. World War II had begun. For Adolf, it was not merely a war, it was the fulfillment of a long-held vision. Military strength, speed, and coordination delivered early victories. One country after another fell under German control. At first, success seemed unstoppable. German armies moved swiftly across Europe. Cities surrendered. Governments collapsed. Propaganda celebrated every advance, portraying Adolf as a strategic genius leading Germany toward its destiny. Crowds once again believed in his promise of greatness. But war, by nature, demands more than belief. As territories expanded, resistance grew stronger. Adolf underestimated his enemies and overestimated his control. He opened multiple fronts, drawing powerful nations into the conflict. The war that had begun with momentum slowly turned into a test of endurance. Behind the front lines, resources were stretched thin. Soldiers faced brutal conditions. Civilian populations suffered. Bombs fell on cities, reducing neighborhoods to ruins. Families were torn apart, and the cost of ambition became impossible to ignore. Adolf responded not with restraint, but with rigidity. He refused to accept retreat or compromise. Generals who questioned his decisions were ignored or punished. Strategy gave way to obsession. What had once appeared as strength began to reveal its weakness. The war that was meant to secure dominance instead consumed everything: lives, cities, and the future of an entire generation. Dehumanization and the darkest crime. While the war raged across Europe, an even greater tragedy unfolded away from the battlefield. Adolf Hitler's ideology was built on division. Long before the war began, he had defined certain groups as enemies within society. Now, with absolute power and a nation mobilized for war, those beliefs turned into systematic actions. What followed became known as the Holocaust. Under Adolf's regime, millions of innocent people were stripped of their rights, their dignity, and ultimately their lives. Families were separated, communities erased. Human beings were reduced to numbers and categories. The machinery of the state was used to carry out unimaginable cruelty. This was not chaos, it was organized, deliberate, and enforced through laws, orders, and obedience. Many participated, some out of belief, others out of fear. Many looked away. The tragedy was not only in the violence itself, but in how normal it became within the system Adolf created. The Holocaust stands as one of the darkest chapters in human history. It revealed what happens when hatred is given authority, when ideology replaces empathy, and when power operates without moral limits. As the war continued, the truth of these crimes could no longer be hidden. The scale of destruction shocked the world. Adolf's vision of a purified and dominant nation had led instead to mass suffering and irreversible loss. By the mid-1940s, Germany was no longer advancing, it was collapsing. Enemies closed in from all sides. Cities burned. Hope disappeared. The empire Adolf Hitler imagined was unraveling, leaving behind devastation that would haunt humanity for generations.
Collapse, paranoia, and the loss of control. In 1944, the illusion of invincibility was gone. Germany was under constant attack. Allied forces advanced from the west, while Soviet troops pushed relentlessly from the east. Cities that once symbolized strength and order were reduced to rubble. The skies were filled with aircraft, the nights burned with fire. For the German people, daily life became a struggle for survival. Food was scarce, homes were destroyed. The promises that had once inspired hope now felt distant and hollow. Slowly, admiration turned into doubt. Inside Adolf Hitler's world, reality began to fracture. As military defeats mounted, he refused to accept responsibility. Instead, he blamed his generals, his allies, and even the German people themselves. Trust disappeared. Suspicion took its place. Those who questioned his orders were removed or ignored. Strategic advice no longer mattered, only loyalty did. Adolf withdrew from public view. The man who once thrived before massive crowds now avoided them. He spent most of his time underground, surrounded by maps, reports, and a shrinking circle of followers. His physical health declined. His mental state grew unstable. He continued issuing commands as if the war could still be won through sheer will. Entire armies were ordered to hold impossible positions. Retreat was forbidden. Surrender was unthinkable. Outside his bunker, Germany collapsed piece by piece. Soldiers fought without supplies. Civilians fled ruined cities. Fear and exhaustion spread across the nation. Many Germans began to ask a painful question: why did we follow him? But Adolf did not allow himself such doubt. To him, defeat was not a failure of leadership. It was proof that others were unworthy of the vision he had imagined. The distance between reality and belief had never been greater. The bunker and the final days. In early 1945, Adolf Hitler retreated permanently into a fortified bunker beneath Berlin. The structure was cold, dark, and sealed away from the collapsing world above. It was designed to protect him from bombs, but it also isolated him from truth. The sound of artillery grew louder each day. Soviet forces closed in on the city. Streets above the bunker became battlefields. Buildings collapsed. Fires burned without control. Inside, time felt suspended. Adolf spent his days reviewing reports, issuing orders to armies that no longer existed, and clinging to the belief that the situation could still be reversed. Advisors urged him to escape or surrender. He refused. To him, surrender meant humiliation, and humiliation was worse than death. Among the few people who remained with him was Eva Braun. She had been part of his life for years, though always kept away from public view. Even as everything fell apart, she chose to stay. Her loyalty was quiet, personal, and tragic. As the end approached, Adolf made one final symbolic decision.
On April 29, 1945, deep inside the bunker, he married Eva Braun. The ceremony was simple, witnessed by only a handful of people. There was no celebration, only acknowledgement that there was no future left to plan for. That night, they spoke privately, reflecting on their lives and the choices that had led them there. Above them, Berlin was being destroyed. The following day, April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler made his final decision. He gathered his closest followers and informed them that he would not allow himself to be captured. To him, control over his own end was the last form of power he had left. Shortly after, Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun took their own lives inside the bunker. He was 56 years old. When Soviet soldiers later reached the site, they found only the remains of a regime that had collapsed from within. The war in Europe ended soon after, with Germany's surrender on May 8, 1945. What remained was devastation, cities in ruins, millions of lives lost, and a world forced to confront the consequences of unchecked hatred and absolute power.
Aftermath, ruins, and a silent wake-up call. When the war in Europe officially ended on May 8, 1945, silence followed the destruction. Germany lay in ruins. Entire cities had been reduced to rubble. Roads, factories, and homes were shattered. Millions of people wandered through the remains of their lives, searching for food, family, and meaning. The nation that had once been promised greatness now faced the weight of unimaginable loss. For many Germans, the fall of Adolf Hitler did not bring immediate relief, it brought shock. The leader who had dominated their thoughts, shaped their identity, and controlled their reality was suddenly gone. His voice disappeared from radios, his image vanished from the streets. What remained were questions. As the world began to uncover the full scale of the crimes committed under his rule, the horror became undeniable. Camps were revealed, survivors spoke, evidence replaced denial. The truth forced itself into public consciousness, and with it came shame, grief, and responsibility. Germany was divided and occupied by foreign powers. The nation had to rebuild not only its cities, but its moral foundation. Laws were rewritten, institutions reformed, education reshaped. The process was painful and slow, but necessary. Adolf Hitler's vision of dominance had ended in total collapse. His pursuit of power had not brought security or pride. It had delivered destruction, suffering, and death on a scale rarely seen in history. The cost was counted not only in ruins and numbers, but in human lives forever changed. History had delivered its verdict. The lessons history cannot afford to forget. Adolf Hitler's story is not just the story of one man. It is the story of how fear, resentment, and unchecked ambition can grow when combined with power and blind loyalty. He did not begin his life as a monster. He began as a human being, shaped by failure, loss, and unresolved anger. But instead of confronting his own shortcomings, he chose to blame others. Instead of seeking understanding, he demanded obedience. Instead of valuing human life, he reduced it to ideology. That is where the true danger lies. History shows us that destruction does not always arrive suddenly. It often begins quietly, with words that divide, with promises that simplify complex problems, with leaders who claim to be the only solution. The tragedy of the 20th century teaches a clear lesson. When compassion is replaced by hatred, when truth is replaced by propaganda, and when power is allowed to operate without accountability, the consequences are devastating. Today, Adolf Hitler's name stands as a warning, not of strength, but of failure. A reminder of how easily societies can be led astray when fear is louder than reason and loyalty is valued more than humanity. The responsibility of the future belongs to those who remember the past. Every choice matters, every voice matters, and every generation must decide whether it will repeat history or learn from it. History is not meant to be admired, it is meant to be understood. Only then can a better future be built.